Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Welcome, welcome. We're just letting people into the call. Thank you so much for joining us. As people are joining into this call today, we would invite you to use the chat window to introduce yourselves. Feel free to include your name, your organization, where you're calling in from, and any other information you'd like us to have before we get this call started, this webinar started today. We're really happy to be with you. We're just letting some people join us. Lovely to see you here, Sunita. Welcome. Hi, Ruth. Welcome to the call. Hi, Tet Tet. Okay, I'm going to get started then. Please keep introducing yourselves as you join. We'll be letting people into the call. This is the first of 3 sessions that the Women and Gender Constituency and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, are co-hosting together as part of the broader Race to Zero dialogues that kicked off this week, which would have been the week that many of us would have been together at the climate negotiations in Glasgow for COP26. And in particular, the Women and Gender Constituency and IISD were very eager to ensure that as part of the resilience dialogues of these Race to Zero dialogues, that we could hone in and focus on the importance of gender responsive and socially equitable resilience to the broader discussion of effective and inclusive climate action. So we've tried to organize a session today that is interactive, that allows us some space in breakout groups and discussions. We have some wonderful discussants on the call, which we'll kick off in a dialogue with. And we have a few interactive tools to hopefully engage you in this discussion as well. Patricia, if you'll go to the next slide, please. Thanks so much. So as we start, I wanted to pass over to my colleague Mara to introduce a few accessibility and house rules and herself.
Hi folks, thanks Bridget. My name is Mara. I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to be serving as accessibility coordinator of this call, which means that if anything comes up during or after the call that you have a request around how we can make this call and this conversation more accessible to you, I'm your person, so please go ahead and direct message me either on Zoom in the chat box. I'm going to stick a little hello message there right now, and if you click my name, you can actually just private message me, or you can send something to my email, mara@wedo.org. And whether that's asking speakers to speak slower, or that you want to be in a specific breakout room, or that you're having difficulty accessing the chat, please write me about anything. I'm here to support you. We're recording the call right now, so if you don't wish for your face to be in the recording, which will be sent around likely to the Women and Gender Constituency, IISD, and folks who are interested in this conversation but weren't able to make it. If you don't want your face in this recording, please just turn your video off. And the recording will not include the breakout rooms, of course. I think that's it from me. Just remember you can contact me at any time. And afterwards, if there are requests for some of the materials featured, the slideshow or the recording, you can also email me about that and I'll help out as best I can. Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks, Mara. Pat, could you go to the next slide for me? Thanks so much. So I wanted to introduce our partners in this call, the International Institute for Sustainable Development. IISD hosts the Secretariat for the National Adaptation Plan, the NAP Global Network. And through this network, IISD has provided technical support to a number of countries to strengthen integration of gender considerations into their NAP, National Adaptation Plan processes. They have also brought countries together to learn from each other about how to practically address gender in NAP processes. And they have developed a number of resources on the topic, including a toolkit for gender responsive NAP processes. And you can find all of that information on the NAP Global Network website, which is on this slide here. And we have 2 further conversations and dialogues that we'll be hosting as part of the Race to Resilience. One which will be focused in Latin America and the Caribbean, and another which will focus on Eastern Europe, Africa, and MENA region as well. And we would invite you, our colleagues from IISD will be helping to co-host those other meetings as well. Patricia, next slide. Thanks so much. Our other co-hosts, which I'm really proudly representing today alongside many of the colleagues who you'll meet in the breakout groups, is the Women and Gender Constituency. The Women and Gender Constituency is one of the 9 official observer constituencies to the UN climate change negotiations, founded in 2009 with around 4 official observer groups to the UNFCCC. That there have been women and gender experts following the climate change process since the very beginning. The constituency was granted full observer status in 2011. We run a program called the Gender Just Climate Solutions, where we really work to showcase solutions that have a whole range of criteria from our analysis in terms of what would make a climate solution resilient and gender just, one which takes into account gender power relations, one which doesn't add to the already definitive care burden that is often on the backs of women, one that has a low, that ensures that we're investing in low emission resources. And so we've been highlighting that since 2015. And over the course of these discussions, hopefully you'll hear some highlights of those examples as well. We are now, since 2020, 32 member organizations and have an advocacy network with around 500 groups and individuals. And for organizations who are interested in getting engaged in the climate change negotiations and supporting and working with other gender experts and women's rights organizations, please go to the womengenderclimate.org. And you can ask questions on this call as well if you'd like to find out more. I'm sorry, I see that the PowerPoint went away for a minute there, but I believe it's back now. So hopefully you can all see that. And it's the last slide anyway. Before jumping into our discussion, we had a quick survey that we wanted to kind of start this conversation with to get some interaction from the audience to see what brought you here and what you're thinking about in terms of what does it mean to center resilience and climate action. So my colleague Mara just put a link to a Mentimeter, which we would ask you to click, and what you'll find is a question that I think Mara will pull up on the screen for you. And you just simply type in an answer to that question, and we're going to see a word cloud. The question here is, what is a key lesson from the pandemic towards resilience and gender responsive climate action? So if you go to that link again and start typing in some answers, the link is in the chat box. Thank you so much. I see we're already getting some answers being typed in. Thank you, Mara, for including that again. Excellent. inclusion, preparedness, limits, interconnectedness, absolutely, capacity building, transformation, resource mobilization. Yes, feel free to submit a number of times if you have a number of things to add. Ownership, injustice, equity, equilibrium. I see preparedness is very coming out really strong, preparedness and inclusion. Excellent. Opportunity, intersectional, wonderful. All right. Mara, if I could ask you to go to the next question, please feel free to keep putting answers in. I see people have already started with the next question. So in what ways can principles of resilience support equity and diversity in climate action? I'm seeing representation, finding power, long-term thinking, building collectively. Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Just transitions, representation. So I'm taking away some of these key questions, key answers that we see here: preparedness, inclusion, representation, long-term thinking, empowerment. And I hope we take these with us into the conversation that we are going to have today. So to give a little bit of framing first before I jump into the discussion with the colleagues that we have on the call today, you know, when we were thinking about to build this session out in the three parts of this series that we're going to be sharing with you, it was really an understanding that from our perspective, the Women and Gender Constituency and IISD, that efforts to build resilience will not be effective nor sustainable and will fall short of their moral obligation unless they depart from current development pathways and deliberately address gender and social inequalities. To drive the transformation that is needed to build resilient economies, ecosystems, and societies, while ensuring that no one is left behind, all stakeholders must show leadership and commitment in promoting gender-responsive, participatory, and representative governance approaches and other mechanisms for engagement. So these dialogues that we've prepared will hopefully explore the challenges and the opportunities for transformation for effective climate action through a focus on resilience and social protection. And some of the key messages that we're hoping to bring not just into this discussion, but really to bring into the broader Race to Resilience and Race to Zero dialogues are that resilience must be at the center of efforts to achieve climate action, that efforts to reduce emissions must address gender and social inequalities towards economies, ecosystems, and societies that are resilient to complex interrelated shocks and stresses such as the COVID crisis that we are all experiencing together at the moment. That effective and sustainable resilience is grounded in participation. To leave no one behind in efforts to build a resilient world, we must ensure that local voices in all their diversity, including women, youth, people living with disabilities, indigenous peoples, have the credence, agency, legitimacy, and the means to co-create and own context-relevant, resilient solutions that are inclusive, participatory, equitable, and lasting. And a lot of that work is around reframing resilience, that we know we have the solutions and examples of resilient climate action that need to be replicated. But this often requires a new thinking around the approach and the understanding of what matters in adaptation, as well as a diversity of scale of what climate solutions look like. And I think another key piece is that there, you know, really owning the phrase "nothing for us without us," that it's not enough to center inclusion in climate responses, but we need to fundamentally change, transform leadership and governance structures towards participatory models that put peoples and communities in decision-making positions and institutions that are equitable and representative of the communities they serve. And so to kind of take us into an initial discussion around what that looks like, what good examples look like, or what conditions need to be met, I'm really pleased to have a couple of discussants on here with us. I'm going to start first with my colleague Nitya Rao, who's from the University of East Anglia. And Nitya is an expert in land and agrarian relations, food security, migration, education, all grounded in a commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment. And so Nitya, I'd love to ask from you, why is resilience critical to climate action, and what are some key structural considerations from a social equity perspective that we should be considering in climate activities to be effective and inclusive? And welcome. Please feel free to introduce yourself further.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And it's really nice to be here with all of you this morning. So I come from India, but I've been working and I teach gender and development at the University of East Anglia. And I've also been researching on issues of land and natural resource management, mainly in rural parts of South Asia, but also East Africa, Kenya and Ethiopia in particular. And of course, one of the key issues confronting us all now is climate change and climate variability. This has really contributed to enhancing poverty, but also the insecurity and the uncertainty which is confronting a lot of the rural people. So what has happened is that given the agrarian distress, particularly in India, we find Nepal, India, South Asia, that men have been moving out into towns, into non-farm work, and women are really left with managing the farms, which are less productive, which are not giving them enough. And in male absence, also they are responsible for everything, the farm work, but also the care work. So some of the big issues that we find that in terms of why is resilience critical to this race to zero, that you increasingly find that groups of farmers who are producers, particularly women. I think one area where I've been personally very concerned about is that health and nutrition and food security. We find that despite the SDGs, actually rather than improving towards zero hunger, for instance, we are going backwards. And since the last couple of years, and I think this COVID pandemic has actually exposed, all the international agencies have admitted that we are going to have another maybe 100 to 130 million people globally, a large number of them in Asia, who are going to actually get more food insecure and go deeper into poverty. So I think we really need, in terms of resilience, first of all, it can't be business as usual. We have to radically reconsider, radically transform our food systems, our ways of production, and our ways of consumption. And I think this is a first starting point for me in terms of resilience. If we don't think about business as usual, but really in the race to zero, we really need to radically rethink our production systems and our consumption systems. I think the second, just two more points, small points. The second thing I think is that, while global solutions, Bridget, you mentioned, but I think given the diversity across our context, it's very important to have the global sort of principles in mind, but to really think local and to think contextual. So, what are the limitations? And here, I don't only mean the geographies and the agroecologies and what can grow or, be produced, be done there, but also gender relations, because gender relations are very contextual. So it's very different, for instance, in Southeast Asia or South Asia. Access to land, access to mobility, what are the kinship patterns, what are the social expectations of gender? So I think the solutions also need to take into account, what are the do's and don'ts, what are the constraints that women and men confront in different contexts. I think you did mention, or it came out in the word cloud, the word intersectionality. I think this is very central. When we're talking about context, we're also talking about intersectionality, about culture, about social positioning, about caste, indigeneity, ethnicity, class, and so on. So that's my second point, that without attention to intersectionality, we can't really move towards the race to zero. And the third point is really about the role of the state. I think in the whole part of the problem, I think, for the decline, to me personally, is this overemphasis on markets and globalization and the private sector and the privatization of resources. Especially we see that in Southeast Asia, that the oil palm plantations, the sort of the commercialization, the commodification of land, of cropping systems, and so on. So that's at one end. But I think what has also happened, that the state and public provisioning is very important, I think, to create a level playing field for everybody, to provide basic services. This again has come up in the pandemic, whether it is healthcare services, like sitting in the UK here, there was such a move against the national health services. But during the pandemic now, everybody has realized that this is very important in terms of good quality, affordable healthcare. So I think childcare, again, for gender equality is very important. Healthcare. So these services and these kinds of social security and social protection, which only the state can provide in an equitable way to all citizens, I think is also very fundamental for the to move towards the race to zero. So I'll just stop with those 3 points at this moment.
Thanks so much, Nitya. And it speaks so much to a lot of what we are thinking about and speaking about, not just with partners around the world, but even in my context in the United States, in terms of the lessons that we're seeing from the pandemic, when there is not an investment in strong social protection and social provisions. And, we talk a lot about that in the context of, from a feminist analysis of a care economy, for example, and why investment in a care economy is central to climate action. And I feel like these kinds of conversations can be really difficult to kind of cut through the noise of what large-scale mitigation action needs to take place in order to combat the climate challenge. But while we are already in an adapting climate, without proper access to social provisions and social protection and to investment in a care economy, it makes that race to zero near impossible, because we don't have that infrastructure of care. So I think a lot of what you said is wholly reflective in kind of the lessons that we're seeing elsewhere as well. Dinda, I'd love to pass over to you. Dinda, who's a community organizer from Indonesia, and please introduce your work and more of what you're doing. But what are the lessons that you are seeing and learning from the pandemic around the importance of social protection and human rights to building resilient economies, ecosystems, and societies, in both what you're seeing as the bad of what's not working with engagement in communities and where you're seeing solutions?
Thank you, Bridget. Well, my name is Dinda Yura. I am based in Jakarta, Indonesia. I'm working with Solidaritas Perempuan, or Women Solidarity for Human Rights. It is a feminist organization with 12 branches, and we are working with grassroots women with our communities, and among them are peasants, fisher folks, migrant workers, urban poor women, indigenous, etc. And we are focusing in to encourage and strengthening their initiative in achieving justice and sovereignty, because basically we believe that the power itself is coming from them. So basically we provide safe and brave space, and also facilitate capacity exchange between them, and let them has their own voices to and amplify it into the advocacy and also campaign strategies. So first of all, I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you. I believe that this topic is very, very important, because sometimes when we are talking about climate actions or climate justice, we are talking about something like very, very general. As the previous speaker said that, Nitya said that it's not only about an actions, but it's also about the diversity and also intersectionality in each community. They have their own perspective, they have their own needs, and also initiative to how to overcome the climate crisis, how to preserve the earth, for examples, and etc. And sometimes when we are talking these climate solutions or racing to zero with a general perspective, then we will like eliminate all of the richness of the diversity. Not only about that, but also sometimes we also like marginalize the initiative that actually more effective when it's conducted like in the micro level. So based on the questions that Bridget asked me, there are a lot of things that we can learn from the pandemic, and of course it's also become the reflections on how we face many type of crisis. Now it's pandemic, but we also facing the climate crisis like every day since a couple of years or even decades, and this will continue until we don't know. And I think Indonesia is one of the worst government in handling the pandemic. It is really, really ridiculous when the pandemic start, Indonesian government were promoting tourism and even gave incentive to tourism business and travel companies. Well, no lockdown until now. We only have like large scale social distancing, and it's not really effective. And also no sufficient number of tests, and we still have thousand new cases every day. So if some of you may be already in the second wave of pandemic, or I really hope that it will be passed. And but in Indonesia, not even we are not even overcome the first wave. And we know that the situation is worsening by lack of social security system, privatization of health services, like number of hospitals, doctors, and other medical persons. So at least there are already like 441,000 people died for COVID-19, and among them including at least 253 doctors and medical persons. And and we know that the patriarchal economic and capitalisms had destroyed our the whole social security system, not only in Indonesia but also in the most of other global South countries. We know that it's not only impacted to the COVID-19 patient, but women face also difficulties in accessing health services, including reproductive health. Even we also find some of the cases that experienced by our communities and also our activists who get pregnant in the pandemic situation, but they are really afraid to go to the hospital to check their health um, conditions because of the pandemic, and they thought that there are a lot of COVID-19 patients in every hospital. So it also affect how we can access the other health services. And but on the other hand, this situation also giving us a lesson learned that people only can rely on people. Well, in fact, there are many initiatives, even though it cannot cover all of Indonesia's geographical areas, but there are many initiatives. Like farmer groups, for example, in the village, they have initiative to collect their rice and some of their crops to contribute to the laborers organizations or other communities in the city who doesn't have like the food plant to feed themselves. And then so do the fisher folks who also send some of their fish or other catches, so they can contribute to people who lost their jobs. And public kitchens are open in many areas in Indonesia with the crowdfunding. Sometimes citizens also put their vegetables and food stuff in their house gate or collect it in one place to be accessed by pedicab driver, domestic workers, builders, and many people. So this pandemic also show us how the food system for all this time is already destroyed, because before our community has this subsistence and also sustainable food system, but now we really depend on the industry because the government also having these food projects or programs that that prioritize export or prioritize the industry rather than to fulfill the food sovereignty for our country. So in the middle of this pandemic, it is proven that the small scale food producer are they are who survive, not only survive for themselves but also contribute to many people's life. So I'm agree that this pandemic or even is the same issues when we are talking about climate crisis is not only about the something like natural or something like it is something that not separated by the patriarchal development paradigm that really destroy the the previous system that basically can be relied by people. And now we are really depend on a lot of things, depend on the industry, depend on the company, even the government also promoting the seeds that produced by the company, while before that the farmers can produce their own seeds. So what we have to do is not only talking about to build in terms of to build resilience or to solve the climate crisis problem. It's not only about the involving communities or women and etc. But we have to dismantling this development system. So, but I think I will stop here because I know that a couple of questions further will also touch about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dinda. I think you touched upon a lot of things, and it goes back to some of the pieces we saw in the word cloud here, where, you know, the work to build resilience is not, there's no checkbox solution to that. There's no add this community and stir, if you will, so crudely, the analysis of how you do inclusion. It really is about understanding the systems that take the access to and the provision of these social services out of the power of communities and people, and making sure that they have that access to it to be able to be resilient across different shocks. And, you know, I think that I think there's a lot of lessons from the current pandemic that we're seeing that need to kind of be drawn from. And I also see that there are some questions coming up in the chat that people have been looking to. I wanted to, my colleague Tamani is just joining us now, but before passing to Tamani, I wanted to, Nitya, come back to you to kind of build off of the pieces that Dinda said. In particular, I know you've talked about the experience. We had questions of what are some examples of engagement with local women in resilient activities, and I know you've had examples of that, so maybe you could speak further to it.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. I saw the questions and I just thought that maybe two small examples from my own work in India that I would like to give. I think it was about really women's engagement in such climate resilience activities. And so one is an older one. It's not only during the pandemic, but this is really that in India, actually, women have been, as I said earlier, that men have been migrating. So women have been left with the farms and they have been at the front line of resilience activities. And I think they have realized that having a diversity of crops, for instance, rather than monocropping, is good both for food and nutrition, but it is also good for resilience. Some of the traditional varieties like millets, for instance, are hardy to rainfall variability, to climate variability compared to paddy. For instance, there's also more, much more resilient crops which were there traditionally. Women have that knowledge. So here I really wanted to say that, where they have been organized, collective action. So in India, actually now we have a big national level, but state by state organization of women farmers, which has been facilitated, called the Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, Women Farmers Rights Forum. And the purpose is to actually try and overcome the constraints that women face. So while women want to do resilience and resilient kind of farming, climate smart agriculture, if you like, but they have a lot of constraints. So they don't have titles to land, so they can't get credit. If they want to grow, let's say, millets, there's no extension services, there is no subsidized seeds available, which are available for your wheat and rice and maize and the main kind of crops. So they are confronted with so much of constraint in terms of where will they get the money to invest in these crops, unless of course they keep the seed. Where will they get additional information if they need? Where will they get the tools? So millets, for instance, which I worked with a group in South India in the hills, and they were cultivating traditionally millets, and they said basically there is no milling system for the millet grain. So it's still hand pounding. And this was too much of work. So it's not a difficult thing to develop mills for millets to reduce women's drudgery. But because it's a women's crop, or it's seen as something that women do, it has not been developed. Today, with a lot of health consciousness amongst the elites and amongst the city urban population and the middle classes, now all the millets that is cultivated in this rural area is directly taken by a trader and exported to the big cities of Mumbai and Ahmedabad and so on in Western India, where it is produced into breakfast cereals or other kinds of things, health foods for us to consume. Whereas those rural people now have been denied that consumption. So I think there are a lot of structural inequalities. This is one example. On the positive side, I would like to say that from the pandemic, I was actually in lockdown in India, in South India, in Chennai. And it was very interesting that during the lockdown for 2 months, both sides, of course, the farmers were affected because suddenly the transport came to a standstill. So they could not sell their crops, they could not sell their outputs, particularly vegetables, fruits, perishable commodities that they were growing for the urban market. In the cities, we were not getting any of this fresh produce. But it was very interesting that actually for the first time, the middle classes, particularly middle class women, who are responsible for producing food, for putting food on the table, let us say, even if not for producing food, we found that cases of violence were going up because one of women's responsibility in terms of care, you mentioned, Bridget, is supposed to be cooking and feeding the household. And in South Asia and India, if women don't cook and feed properly, or they don't produce a meal, then it's seen okay that, for men to be violent towards them. But of course, the other thing was that men was also lost their jobs. They were sitting at home and they were frustrated without incomes. So violence went up. But women then came out in large numbers on the internet, on other things, asking for support, that they wanted to do small terrace gardening or rooftop gardening or in a little patch in their house. And they said, we really need to cultivate some vegetables, some fruits, some basic food which can add to our diets. So apart from the shortage, the loss of this during the pandemic really made people, particularly women, I think, who are responsible for food security in many ways, fairly or unfairly, but take up to and make queries. And this has now become a real movement. If you see the number of media reports and so on that are coming out, that urban agriculture and peri-urban agriculture and using all spaces which are available. It's also as a way of solid waste management and urban sustainability. So suddenly you have talk of urban and peri-urban agriculture as a way to move towards urban sustainability. And I think this is led by women. I think this is a great move. It may take some time for this to happen, but I think this is one outcome which I see, that for the middle classes to actually become aware, because I think the poor are aware. Poor women are at the front are the front end, front line, facing climate crisis in their everyday lives. But I think for the middle classes to become aware that there is a climate crisis, there is a crisis, and we need to be and live much more sustainably. There I see some hope towards actually change in terms of the transformation that I would like to see in this race to zero. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitya. Those are really, really wonderful examples, and certainly very reflective of what we see in communities around the world as well. And I'm really pleased to also now pass over to my colleague, Tamani, who's an incredible youth activist from Fiji. And Tamani, welcome to the call. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of this context of resilient solutions and race resilience, I should say, what do you see as examples of where gender equality, human rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and inclusion broadly are helping to build better and more effective communities and climate solutions? And what are we seeing in terms of the lessons from the pandemic in your experience that show why we have to center resilience in our climate action? Over to you, Kamini. You're still muted, just so you know.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for that introduction. And again, I apologize for joining the meeting late. It's sometimes sort of like issue that's happening in Fiji where time is taking, an hour ahead and then a bit later. So sorry about that. So resilience for, for a lot of us, and I know Nika shared more about this and Dinda. And it's, we have similar experiences in Fiji, especially during COVID in particular, where, a lot of issues has been exacerbated and brought to the forefront. And so one of the real issue that came about that was, that activists, civil society could identify during the pandemic was that the lack thereof of like social protection mechanisms for women, for young people, and for those who did not, who were in informal job sector, but also in CADWEC. And so when the government assistance came about, and the the opportunity only was for those who were into like white collar jobs and who had superannuation access. And so a lot of women in particular were left out of this process. They did not have the security to be able to look after the financial security, but also like the other various means of access of resources which they could access during COVID in particular, whether it's land, whether it's these agriculture seedlings and etc. They, women were definitely the ones that was left behind in all these processes. And so in Fiji, there were the civil society organization, particularly women's feminist organization, came together and said, like, the government is the interventions of the government is not addressing the people that we really is affected by this the pandemic. And so they formed this humanitarian coalition in which they were able to address and make their news, that coalition, to substantiate recommendations and influence policies to the government and make the influencing thereof. So for young people, one of the things, because I work mostly with young people, and so within all diversities, and one of the things that young people identified was that during the pandemic, was that because there were like all of these restrictions in place, etc. And a lot of people, especially those who were because in Fiji, there's a lot of like rural to urban migration. And so those who were within the urban centers did not have access to backyard farming. And so this was identified as a gap. And so young people quickly identified this gap and worked alongside, institutions that were already working in those areas to support young people who were keen to do backyard farming for their communities. And so this included like, very basic training, and then eventually moving into beekeeping and other forms of farming methods in which that's sustainable, especially in the instances where movement, there's not just so much movement of like, transferring of the goods, etc. But women in Fiji were the branch, became one of the major constituents who were directly impacted by COVID, but also by the lack of social protections, because violence exacerbated in a very it was just skyrocketing to a point that it was unbelievable, like to a 200%, to a rate. And because a lot of like, communities were, within those restriction places were, women were living with the abuses and etc., did not have the means, the financial security to move out, to find dependency during these terms, in that instance. So there was a lot of violence. We had a record number of call of people who are calling the helpline, and this, the statistics are quite alarming. And so, at the end of the day, it really comes to like ensuring that women has been a resilient number, not number, but a resilient member of our community for so long and for many decades. And but how long do they remain resilient for is the question. And so that is the need. That is really the area then where the government it needs like this whole nationwide approach, particularly in Fiji. And I'm not going to speak for the Pacific, but like in Fiji in particular, this needs like a cross-sectoral national approach in order to ensure that women are looking to when it comes to like social benefits in terms of agriculture, looking at agriculture as an industry, as a and how they can the government can better ensure that the mechanisms in place are gender responsive to their needs. So it does not happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamani. No, I think I'm seeing there's so many threads through all of these examples in different countries and different regions. I think that there's so much focus on the transition to a low carbon society, a transition from a very strong focus on an energy perspective. And that is important, but what's important as well in the context of energy and food and agriculture is this idea of sustainable choice, which is only possible through resilient communities and the provision of sustainable and resilient societies and social protection. And I think that we're hearing that so much in the context, obviously, of this pandemic, but also, when working with communities in Fiji and other Pacific countries and other communities, not just in low-lying or small island developing states that are facing onslaught, increasing disasters, even in communities in countries such as the United States, facing increasing floods, droughts, disasters, both immediate and slow onset due to climate change. We're seeing the same things that are happening as a result of the pandemic, happening as a result of climate shocks and emergencies because of that lack of access to social protection and because of gender inequalities and social inequalities, increases in violence, lack of food security, lack of access to proper healthcare services, and the ability to be able to build back post-disaster, post-climate shock, post-pandemic is really dependent upon the amount in which society has access to and control over resources, as well as access to rights, and I think fundamentally access to justice as well. So it's really helpful to kind of see how we can weave these threads into what this means towards building climate solutions. Dinda, I wanted to come back to you just to see if you wanted to further share any thoughts in terms of the practical steps that you feel or you see in the communities that you work with are needed to be able to shift from current development pathways. If you agree that the current pathway that we're on is importantly flawed at this time.
Thank you, Bridget. Well, it's really hard for me actually to find any examples of how the communities can like fully involve or meaningfully involve, or well, actually what we need is not only involve, but the development itself has to be community oriented, because they are the one who know exactly what they need, and they are the one who know exactly what can be grow for the examples, or what can be done in their communities as a development. So therefore, I think, but we also have a lot of examples on how the women and also the communities really fight on the ground. So even though there are a lot of them cannot access the negotiations like UNFCCC, like us, but they really doing the real battle on the ground when they resist the mining company, for examples, or the palm oil plantations in their area. I will just share to you a couple of stories, not really long, just briefly. Like this year, in the middle of a pandemic, like women in East Nusa Tenggara fighting for their customary forest. They are from indigenous group, and their forests want to occupy it by the government for the investment in some communities. And then at this struggle, women were joining the protest. They use their body to resist by open their clothes to prevent the government and polices grabbing their land. And also this year, women in Kapuas, Central Kalimantan, were trying to occupy their land that already grabbed by the palm oil plantations. And we can also learn from indigenous women in Kendeng Mountain, who had their initiative in conducting protests against cement factories by cement their feet in front of President's Palace. Even though there are a lot of debates about their health conditions because of their cement, their feet, but this is something that coming from their own initiative and their own considerations, and we need to respect that strategy, of course, because they are really defend their life. So in all of those movement, it's only like a few movement that I mentioned, but we also learn that women always in the heart of the struggle, and their purposes are always not only to defend their land, but also to preserve the environment and to make sure that this earth is survive for future human civilizations. I think from that stories we can learn that how we have to put or we have to design our development. The communities they have their capacity and their ability to design. So first step will be to consolidate and strengthening communities, let them fight and grab their sovereignty, let they have their political positions to defend their rights, because by defending their rights they also it also means that they're defending the environment, because their life is not separated with the natural resources, and they live like in tune with them. And every community should have right to reject the projects and programs that will harm environment and people, while also we also need change in the government system, including UNFCCC policy, like cut the polluters from negotiations. And we also need more space and mechanism, not only to involve communities, but ensure we are taken into account in every decision making process. But the first thing that we as an activist also have to believe that the communities can have their own voice and their own initiative, because they are the one who most know about what they need and about what can be conducted or what can be done in their areas. So yeah, keep fighting because another world is possible. Thank you.
Sorry, I was excited. Thank you, Dinda. Yes, absolutely. I agree with that sentiment. I'd love to turn the floor over to Nitya and then to Mani for kind of initial closing thoughts on this part of the discussion as we move into breakout groups following this, on what's come up on these questions of how do we center resilience and whether this another world is possible, which it is, of course.
Thank you, Bridget. I think I liked that from Dinda about keep fighting. And I think we have to keep fighting, and we've learned that, you keep fighting, you have some victories, you have some defeats, but one has to keep fighting. I think in terms of departure pathways or practical steps, I think two things that I wanted to highlight in addition, I think, to keep fighting. One, we did a study actually on women's agency in climate hotspots across Asia and Africa. And this put together cases from 25 different contexts in Asia and Africa. And which we felt, I think our starting assumption was that women's agency, women's ability to act, to have control is very important to adaptation and to resilience. But we found that in these climate, what was defined as hotspots is basically places which are very vulnerable geographically. So the arid and semi-arid, the mountainous regions, deltas, and so on, that actually we found that women were unable to really act or to really take decisions. So rather than women being able to act, we found they were unable to act in these hotspots, which was very disturbing, because that's exactly what we want. And when we explored what are the reasons for this, we found, of course, poverty is there, but poverty doesn't stop them. I think this whole structural or institutional barriers was weighing down too heavily on them. So this is one point, when we're talking about a departure pathway, I had started with this, but I again want to emphasize that this is very, very critical, that to provide an enabling environment, to provide basic services of health, of hygiene, of education, which can create the ground. Once women have these basics, they can collectivize, they can take initiative, they can take action. Credit. We found that women in this crisis even, and we have seen in this research that whenever there are floods, whenever there are droughts, women sell off whatever little asset they have, and then they become more dependent on men, they become more subject to violence. and to abandonment because they don't have land titles. So in pandemic, we saw that large scale, because the men were stuck and without incomes in India, women sold off whatever jewelry they had in order to make the household meet. I'm really scared that what will happen, they have nothing left. How will they rebuild their lives without any credit support, without any social security and support? So I think I can't emphasize enough the point made earlier from Fiji as well about social security, about strengthening social support. But in addition to social protection, I think social or public services, I really want to emphasize, should be a right. To give one very small example is water. During the pandemic, we say that water is a human right and so on. And during the pandemic, one of the things that was being told to people is hygiene, hand washing, and so on. So I did research in Kenya amongst pastoralist groups on adaptation. And actually, that is a drought-prone area. They've been subject to climate change. In the last 10 years, every other year is a drought. They don't have water. And the government is not providing water. Water service has become totally privatized in much of sub-Saharan Africa. So to buy one jerry can of 20 liters of water, women have to, the cost of it is like 50 Kenyan shillings. And this is, just to give an example, this is like about half or 1/3 of a daily wage. So if women go out for wage, they can earn between 100 to 150 shillings a day. And out of that, 50 shillings during drought period is the cost of one jerry can of water, which is 20 liters. Women cannot afford more than one jerry can. So you can imagine, how are they going to do hand washing? This is just enough even for drinking. How are they going to do hand washing? How are they going to do hygiene? So this is a very real, concrete example of, we can talk everything. We can say women should be resilient. We should collectivize. But there are some structural, practical problems that women in the low and middle income countries face, rural women face, women who are really at the front line of climate change face, and they need the support in terms of both social services as well as social protection. This last point I would like to really make in terms of departure pathways is rights. I think this has been mentioned. And, I've been fighting personally, but also with the collective, a lot of collectives in South Asia. We have built a network of women involved in agricultural work to really fight for equal rights and equal entitlements. And here I would really like to make a plea at the global level as well, that just like with a lot of feminist advocacy in the SDG 5 goal, we managed to get SDG 5.4, which, as you said, Bridget, is on reduce, redistribute, and recognize unpaid care work and support unpaid care work. I think while there are a lot of SDGs which talk about, equal employment opportunities, etc., equal access to resources, but I think we really need a separate, similar to the 3 R's, something like a 4 R's, in fact, in terms of not just reduce drudgery of women's productive work. So while reproductive work is there, I think in a lot of the development world, in South Asia, I know I've already said, also in sub-Saharan Africa, women are doing more than 60% of all agricultural work, which is productive work, but they don't have any entitlements. They don't have entitlement to land. They don't have entitlement to livestock. They don't have entitlement to fisheries or to boat ownership. They're equally participating, but they don't have access or rights to any of these resources. So I think we have to give them the rights, but we have to recognize. First way to give the rights is we have to recognize that they are doing 60% of this work. Secondly, we have to find some way of reducing the drudgery of this work. I had done time use surveys in India where actually during the peak seasons, women were working almost 8 to 10 hours on their farms, and they had very little time left in addition to do all the domestic work, the cooking and the feeding, and so on. So we really need to find some ways to reduce drudgery of productive work as well. Of course, redistribution of resources, of productive resources, recognize and value women's work. And also, I would like to add representation, that in a lot of these production decision-making, agricultural policies are made, work-related policies are made, climate action plans are made, but women are not represented on any of these tables. In fact, recently, we are just in the process of doing a study of state, in India as a federal country, of 28 state climate adaptation plans, the SAPs, and actually more than half of them are completely gender blind. And there's just 1 or 2 which have in their planning process brought women onto the table. So I think India is a large country. Out of 28 states in India, maybe 3 or 4 states at most have brought women on the table. So I think we still have a long way to go in terms of ensuring we cannot make headway in terms of resilience because if we agree that women are at the front line without actually also giving women equal representation in this. So I think those are my 2 sort of departure pathways that I would like to emphasize as closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitya. Those were really, really powerful closing remarks. And I think that one of the things that really stuck with me from that, in addition to our 4 R's, which I think we should take with us, is something we speak to all the time, whether we're talking about finance or climate actions, that this focus on a focus on empowerment without really thinking about power, without thinking about what does it mean to not just target solutions at particular groups of communities or people, but actually understand who has access to power, who has access to rights, and what does it mean to deal with the structural issues that we spend way too much time avoiding, the structural inequalities, and therefore just coming up with solutions that don't deal with the real challenges there. So I think that's something that's kind of part of all of our work. And I've seen a few questions, which I see you're accessing right now, Nitya, in terms of people really would like information on the studies that you've done. Tamani, I would love to just quickly pass to you for any closing remarks you have, and then we are going to jump over into our breakout groups.
Thank you, Bridget. I don't have much to say apart from just reinforcing the message that was shared by Dinda and Nina earlier about the keep fighting. And I think for us, we're at a period where we've lost, we're losing a lot of energy of the work that we've been working on. But I think we just got to keep on doing this and start. Hopefully that work is inspiring to the younger generation like myself and the others who are able to continue the great work that many of you have been doing for over the years. But I think the last one I wanted to talk about is definitely the need to also ensure that indigenous knowledge when it comes to resilience and all these varieties of issues that we're talking about is part of the package, because for us in Fiji, this is something that clearly came out as a great social safety net. When everything was happening, a lot of us were falling back into the indigenous and the traditional knowledge of how to conserve food, because not electricity was up, but there were a lot of things that needed to be kept for within the household. The way people were planting the food. And so these were indigenous knowledge that a lot of people were not aware of. And so we started ensuring that within the youth network we were participating in, that everybody was able to grasp this knowledge again, and and etc. But definitely we think that representation of women within government boards in different spaces that we have around us in order to address these structural barriers and inequalities. And for Fiji, one of the recent reports that came out is there was a lack of women's representation in especially government boards where heavy decision making are being made, whether it's on financing. And like Nina had said, it's still important that women are represented in these various forums. Apart from that, I don't have much to say, but yeah. The last one is probably the definitely need to have mechanisms in place for unpaid care work, which is one of the things that came out strongly for here in Fiji as well, is that women did not have the means to access resources and financial resources as well when the pandemic hit, and a lot of them were left out. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Tamani. No, I think that I hear a key message coming across as well and certainly one that resonates here is that the foundation for resilient society to combat the climate challenge is investment in care and social protection. And I think that that lends itself in different communities and different regions to different contexts and different solutions, but it's fundamentally, I think, a core that cuts across each of the intervention that we've heard here. I'd like to really thank Dinda, Nitya, and Tamani for sharing these interventions. Thank you. Some applause for you. And we're going to move into breakout groups, but before doing so, we wanted to we're really looking to give the opportunity in the breakouts to hear from others who are on the call, their experiences or any questions they might have. We have 3 quick survey questions just to get a sense from those on the call how we're feeling about the challenges and opportunities of this moment. So I'm going to ask my colleague Mara to help me pull up the first question that we have. Great, thank you for this. So the question is, what are key barriers to putting gender equality and social inclusion at the center of climate resilience efforts? It's multiple choice, including lack of data, information and evidence, a business as usual approach to climate, siloed approaches to climate change versus social justice or biodiversity, unequal representation of people and communities, a sense that it's not worth it or it's not a good investment, or something else. Give you just a few minutes. Excellent. Are we able to share the results of this now? Perfect. Oh, yes. So as we can see, the top answer was unequal representation of people and communities in leadership and decision-making spaces, but also feeling like this is including siloed approaches to climate change, or business as usual approach phrased in the collective. Thank you for that. We have 2 other questions. The next one, please. Thank you. So this one is, in what sectors or sectors are the greatest opportunities for implementing gender and socially just resilience measures? Agriculture, transportation, energy, forestry, fisheries, aquaculture, social development, or all of the above? Or other. We don't have an other there, but you can put an other in the chat if you'd like. You can move something. Excellent. I'm sorry if I'm breaking up a little bit. Can you see me?
Yes.
I'm not. Someone has just, okay, great. I thought I might have been frozen. Thanks for that. Can we show the results on this? Great. So it seems like there's a shared agreement that there's a great opportunity not just in agriculture, but this is a little deceiving as a poll because we also have a good result for all of the above, but also strong feelings around water, health, social development. I know there's a whole host of people that would surely feel like transport and infrastructure are also very important as well. So this is just to understand in this community, in this group, what people are focused on. We have one further poll that we'll launch now. So obviously we're part of the Race to Zero dialogues, and there's a lot of discussions around net zero and moving to net zero. So it's just a question of, is the concept of net zero one that supports your idea of resilience? And it's a simple yes, no, or maybe, but I have concerns. Okay, I think we can show results on that. Great, so there's seeming a good split between yes and maybe, but I have concerns, which seems like I think people do want to move towards what is needed, ambitious action, but perhaps I think that the pathways to a transition to ensuring that they are just is something that that people want to make sure there are clear principles around engagement, right? So it makes sense that it'd be interesting to hear what some concerns would be at another time in another discussion. So thank you for participating in that polling with us. We wanted to get people's brains circulating around certain ideas. We're gonna now move into breakout groups, and my colleague Mara is gonna move folks into breakout groups facilitated by my colleagues Patricia, Melio, Kavita, and Shraddha. So there'll be 4 breakout groups. And in those breakout groups, you're gonna be, you'll just be there for about just under 30 minutes, talking about 2 specific questions, further thinking through what the key barriers to putting gender equality and social inclusion at the center of climate resilience efforts are. And then secondly, what changes are needed to realize the transformation towards gender responsive and socially inclusive resilience. And we really welcome you to bring your own examples, your own concerns, or opportunities that you see in your own communities into that discussion. So over to you, Mara, for the magic breakout group.
Thanks, Bridget. So I'm going to put folks into breakout rooms now. It's going to take a minute or 2, so please just be patient. And if you have an issue, you can put it in the chat, messaging me, or raise your hand and I'll come help. All right, let's go.
interesting example that was given from NK, an Indigenous woman from Northeast India, where they shared that during the pandemic, the Indigenous women found that reviving the traditional and Indigenous knowledge was a means to protect their food security, including finding ways of, traditional medicines that would be able to help in some way protect them from the ongoing crises. So I think, again, so the main one here would be the revival of traditional and Indigenous knowledge as a means of ensuring that, we've got a transformation that's socially inclusive and includes women who are traditionally the holders of Indigenous knowledge in most of these communities.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Kavita. We're seeing that as really coming out incredibly strong in all of the interventions that we've had so far. I'm going to pass to Pat now.
Thanks so much, Bridget. We have also heard, I think, similar issues, in particular in relation to decision making. So this has been identified as a great barrier. And then what we have also seen is that land rights issues do hinder women and girls to access land, for example, for agricultural activities. And there are new investors and actors coming up in that field. So it seems to be rather an increasingly growing problem instead of one that is going to be solved. And it has also been mentioned that many different stakeholders are involved in this area. So it's more difficult to address and advocate for equal land rights in this regard. And what we have heard, what should be changed is definitely that we do have finance schemes, for example, for building up infrastructure in energy and also also, of course, transportation. So to make sure basic needs are fulfilled, and also to take the topic of inclusiveness and gender equality more seriously and not put it at the very end of the discussion. And also to take it seriously in industrial countries as well. I do feel these have been the main points, but please feel free to just type into the chat box if I've missed anything.
Thank you so much, Pat. Malio, how about from you?
We had a great discussion that echoes a lot of what Kavita shared. We heard that both in Kyrgyzstan and Rwanda, and as we know, many other places in the world, the patriarchal societies are a major barrier for women to organize and have decision-making power. Also, yeah, again, many of the policy-making processes are male-oriented, and I appreciated that what Olivia articulated, that there's a mismatch from policy innovations for what's needed on the ground because of that lack of representation in the decision-making spheres. And some of the solutions that were put forth were building women's leadership, creating opportunities for them to answer their local councils at the rural level. So local, rural level empowerment of women in decision-making spaces. And we also spoke a little bit about how responses from COVID could and should be transformational moving forward to include lots of different areas of social assistance.
Great, thank you so much for that. And finally, our final group was Shraddha.
Hi. Our group was talking a lot more in terms of the broader understanding of, what do we mean by gender when we are who do we include when we discuss gender equality? Are we looking at all the gender minorities? Do we understand the intersectionality and the spectrum of gender in a system that's rather has more of a binary approach? So there was some discussion on how inclusive and intersectional these spaces are, and also even in understanding the interlinkages between issues like migration, food security, and gender-based violence. It was sort of difficult to sensitized the space, which did not understand the whole spectrum and still had a very linear approach to understanding these issues. So that was definitely identified as a barrier, especially in terms of how governments and businesses responded to these diverse realities and contexts. For instance, an example mentioned was trans women are hardly included in heteronormative policies. But even if conversations on resilience make sense in this platform, how would it make sense for that group? So that was one of the issues shared. There was also discussion around lack of data. Like, although there's umbrella large scale data on women and other genders being disproportionately affected, relevant disaggregated data that could be used by advocacy groups and activists to work with government and organizations on policy issues was still something that's is still something that's largely missing. And I think what was most interesting was discussion on the access to land and resources, something which Kavita and Malia have already touched upon, and even the recognition of rights of indigenous women especially, and their right to determine the solutions they want to implement in their lands. And also one of the barriers is accountability from organizations or governments or corporations which are implementing some of these solutions. Since they don't recognize the diversity and circumstances, especially for young people, it's hard to get them to create a process for enabling access and gender equity or social inclusion. And some of the changes that people did ask for were inclusive decision making, transparent processes and gender budget, legal structures that ensure constitutional rights, and representation, like having voices from the marginalized communities, since policies are sort of very non-inclusive at the sense. And also we just briefly were able to touch upon how people were not engaging in such conversations, fearing backlash. So sort of bit on the state of human rights and freedom of speech in some of the countries, in most of the countries of Asia, where a lot of activists and advocacy organizations are not able to participate in the local processes. So that is what our group was talking about.
Thank you for that, Shraddha, and thank you all for actively engaging in those working groups on what has been now a 2-hour session, and taking the time and making space for this. I think we see the opportunity as the Women and Gender Constituency and IISD to really bring a strong message of resilience and social equality and gender equality into not only this broader resilience focused set of activities, but in the Race to Zero dialogues itself, where I would say that our voices and the voices of those on this call, the voices of community leaders, of Indigenous peoples, of grassroots activists, really need to be centered in what actually makes for climate resilient solutions, because it's so often that these conversations do happen in spaces that are disparate from and separate to and siloed from these broader conversations on climate action. And I think it's, fundamentally a missing piece of a very complex puzzle in terms of how we need to invest in our societies in order to be able to combat this climate challenge. So we're really grateful that you were part of this conversation with us. I'm going to put in the chat window, again, we have 2 further conversations, which you are very welcome to join any of them, even though they are at different times, with the hope of being able to speak to people in different regions, as we're all dealing with trying to host these spaces across different time zones. We have a really wonderful set of discussants who are joining us on the 12th of November, and then again on the 16th of November to further talk through some of these issues. And before we close, we have one further Mentimeter that my colleague Mara just put in the link, and she'll share on her screen, that we'd love for you to click on and add to, which is really about some key messages that we would like to see and bring into the Race to Zero dialogues that are happening. And while people are finding their way onto the Mentimeter, again, key messages around gender and social justice, do you hope will come out of these Race to Zero dialogues that are happening? I did see you, David, here on the call, and I wondered if there was anything about the dialogues or Race to Resilience that while people are adding these comments in that you maybe wanted to add, that people should know of where to go and get information. And it's okay if I'm putting you on the spot and you don't actually have anything to add.
Thanks, Bridget. I was just typing something in the chat box to say, how much I really enjoyed the dialogue.
Oh, David, sorry, I think you've muted.
Yeah, I managed to mute myself by mistake. I'll put my photograph on. You can see I'm sort of competing to be Father Christmas this year with my beard. That's just an aside. Yeah, but no, this is fantastic dialogue, and the champions, while they're moving on Race to Zero, they also planning a campaign on resilience, and it's probably going to be called Race for Resilience, where we really want to make an impact, and also where we really want to embed gender in that. And so all these lessons that we've come today to feed into that. But so the invitation is to join more of these dialogues, particularly the two further ones on gender. But we've got some other fantastic ones on voices from the front line, and on the 17th, the champions with senior representation from Chile, the UK, and also others will be setting out their plans. And again, my thinking is we're building a movement to transform what we're doing and to seize the opportunity that COVID has presented. Now, while COVID has been a disaster for many, it also is a wake-up call and an opportunity to move to a better world. So do join us on that. So thanks, Bridget. And I've just I'll put the things in the chat box with the links and stuff. I think Bridget has already as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David, and thank you for sharing those links. And thank you all for adding some of these key messages of a very strong message of intersectionality, of inclusion, nothing about us without us, women central to the race, responsive leadership, gender equity, dismantling patriarchy, empowering all women, increasing representation, women's agency. These are really important key messages. We will take all of these pieces from this call and from the subsequent 2 calls. We aim to be in touch with all of you. This call has been recorded, so you'll have access to it, and we'll share any of the resources that were mentioned from our wonderful discussants earlier in the call that many of you were interested in. And with that, I would love to conclude this call. Wish you all safe and healthy time rest of 2020. I hope we'll see each other through these spaces and online spaces. But thank you again for joining us today, and we will be in touch with further results and outputs from these calls as well. Thank you so much. You can unmute if you'd like to say farewell.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. So lovely to see your faces.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It was a great discussion.
Thanks, Olga. Lovely to see you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye, John. Bye, NK.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, Sanibel. Nice to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. Bye.
So glad to see all of you.
Oh, bye.
Stay strong.
Yes, you too, NK.
That's very strong.
Bye, David. All right, farewell.
See you soon.